Major General John K. Singlaub began his remarkable military journey as a young and daring airborne lieutenant, drawn to a life of courage and challenge. When the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, America's premier intelligence agency during World War II, offered him the opportunity to take part in hazardous duty behind enemy lines, he didn't hesitate. He volunteered for Operation Jedburgh, a secret mission that dropped small three-man teams deep into Nazi-occupied Europe to arm, organize, and lead local resistance fighters. Parachuting into occupied France, Singlaub became a vital link between the Allied command and the French resistance, training ordinary men and women to carry out sabotage, ambushes, and guerrilla warfare against German forces. Once the Nazis were driven out of his area, Singlaub's restless spirit sought new danger and new purpose. Fearing he might miss the rest of the war, he volunteered for the Far East and was soon sent to China, where he trained another guerrilla unit to fight the Japanese in Indochina. Just before the Japanese surrender, he led a daring mission to rescue Allied prisoners of war on Hainan Island, a dangerous and daring feat that showcased his courage, resourcefulness, and leadership under pressure. The missions led by Singlaub and his OSS comrades during World War II laid the foundation for what would later become the U.S. Army Special Forces, Green Berets, and set the tone for the modern era of American special operations. When historian Bob Bergen sat down with Major General Singlaub years later, the conversation peeled back the layers of his early life and the choices that led him into the shadowy world of special operations. At the time of Pearl Harbor, Singlaub was a Reserve Officers Training Corps (ROTC) cadet at UCLA, already preparing for a military career. His passion for service had begun much earlier, in 1937, when he joined junior ROTC at Van Nuys High School. By 17, he had already enlisted in the Army Reserve, determined to become an infantry officer. He applied for an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, but politics intervened. His congressman refused to nominate him because of his family's political affiliation. Undeterred, Singlaub pursued his dream through UCLA's ROTC program, eventually earning his commission in January 1943. From there, he went straight into parachute school at Fort Benning, Georgia, the birthplace of the American Airborne. It was there that fate intervened. An OSS recruiter arrived at Fort Benning to review the records of promising young officers. Those who spoke foreign languages were invited to apply for an unknown organization that specialized in hazardous duty behind enemy lines. Singlaub was intrigued. "I thought I was already in a unit preparing for hazardous duty," he later said with a grin. But OSS sounded interesting. What pleased him most was discovering that the OSS was interested in his French, not his Japanese, both of which he had studied at UCLA. That skill would soon determine his destiny. By October 1943, Singlaub was in Washington, D.C., reporting to the munitions building on Constitution Avenue, an old temporary structure from World War I that still served as part of the government's wartime nerve center. The next morning, he was told to meet in the parking lot of Q Building nearby. Along with several other recruits, he was loaded into the back of a 2.5-ton army truck, the back flaps closed to conceal their destination. When one of the curious young officers asked where they were headed, the driver replied, "The Congressional Country Club." Everyone laughed. Surely it was a joke. But it wasn't. The OSS had requisitioned the actual Congressional Country Club in Maryland, transforming its fairways and ballrooms into secret training grounds for America's first covert operatives. At the club, the new recruits were not yet taught to shoot or blow things up. Instead, they underwent psychological assessment. The instructors wanted to know how they handled pressure, confusion, and betrayal. In group exercises, a student would always make mistakes, but he was actually a member of the training staff, planted to test leadership and emotional control. Those who lost their tempers or froze under stress would soon find themselves reassigned. Singlaub, cool-headed and analytical, thrived in this demanding environment. After less than a week, the group was transferred deeper into Maryland, to a secluded site once used as a boys' camp, a place President Franklin D. Roosevelt had nicknamed Shangri-La, and which the world would later know as Camp David. Here, the real training began. At Shangri-La, the OSS recruits learned the deadly arts of silent killing, sabotage, and survival. Their chief instructor was none other than Major William Fairbairn, a legendary British soldier and police officer who had once headed the Shanghai Municipal Police and developed a brutal system of hand-to-hand combat. Fairbairn's lessons were direct and practical, no fancy moves, only what could kill quickly and silently. He also taught knife fighting, using the iconic Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, which he designed with his comrade Major Bill Sykes. To Singlaub and his fellow Americans, Fairbairn's training was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was a raw education in the ruthless mechanics of survival behind enemy lines. Fairbairn's presence in OSS training was no accident. 2 years earlier, President Roosevelt had sent William Wild Bill Donovan to Britain to study their experience with espionage, subversion, and special operations. Donovan returned home convinced that the U.S. needed to master what he called the fourth dimension of warfare. The first three, land, sea, and air, were well known. The fourth was the invisible war fought in the enemy's rear, resistance movements, sabotage networks, and psychological warfare. The OSS was built to wage that hidden war, and officers like Singlaub were its chosen weapons. Once his American training was complete, Singlaub and his team were sent to Great Britain, where the real preparation for Europe began. Upon arrival, they were placed under British command, trained by the Special Operations Executive, SOE, Britain's elite sabotage and intelligence organization. Everything, from their parachute drills to their demolition techniques, was run to British standards. The combined OSS-SOE headquarters in London became the nerve center for Operation Jedburgh, where Americans, Britons, and Free French officers were molded into small multilingual teams that would strike deep behind enemy lines in the days leading up to and following D-Day. For young Lieutenant John Singlaub, this was not just war, it was the birth of a new kind of soldier. A soldier who could blend into the shadows, rally the oppressed, and turn occupied territories into battlefields. From the skies over France to the jungles of Indochina, Singlaub's courage, intelligence, and adaptability made him one of the defining figures of early American special operations, a man whose legacy would shape the tactics and spirit of the U.S. Special Forces for generations to come. When asked where he trained in Britain, Major General John K. Singlaub recalled that the journey began in the rugged terrain of Scotland in December 1943. There, amid the harsh winter winds and misty hills, the newly formed Jedburgh teams underwent their initial preparations, sharpening both their physical endurance and mental resilience. By January 1944, they were relocated to southern England for advanced instruction, and by April, their final destination was Milton Hall near Peterborough, a sprawling estate that became the nerve center of Jedburgh training. The plan had originally been for the United States to provide 50 officers and 50 enlisted radio operators, but the final count stood at 47 officers and roughly the same number of radio operators. This elite force was to become part of one of the most daring and secretive operations of World War II, Operation Jedburgh. The name itself, borrowed from a Scottish border town known for its fierce warriors, symbolized the mission spirit, bold, unconventional, and unyielding. Singlaub explained that each Jedburgh team consisted of 3 men, 1 English-speaking officer, either British or American, 1 officer native to the occupied country where they would be deployed, and one skilled enlisted radio operator. The foreign officers were primarily French, though a handful of Belgians and Dutchmen also joined the ranks. Their training, conducted under the supervision of the British Special Operations Executive (SOE), was nothing short of exceptional. The British instructors, veterans of clandestine warfare honed in colonial campaigns, taught the Americans and their allies invaluable lessons in demolitions, sabotage, and covert operations, skills the Americans had yet to master. Even though Singlaub was already a qualified paratrooper, the British required all Jedburghs to complete their own airborne course. Their methods were more refined and far safer than the American system, and Singlaub later credited them with saving countless lives. The British had developed the parachute landing fall (PLF), a technique to absorb the shock of impact, and though it would take years for the Americans to adopt it, it made a lasting impression on Singlaub. He also noted that the British parachutes differed in design. Instead of deploying immediately from the jumper's pack, they were contained in a bag at the end of the static line, opening only after the suspension lines had fully extended. This innovation dramatically reduced canopy malfunctions and improved safety during jumps. The British also used bombers as their primary jump aircraft, removing the belly turret and lining the opening with wood to create what the men called the Joe hole. The term Joe became a sort of grim joke among the men. As Singlaub put it, the RAF never referred to us as agents or humans, we were just another Joe. The British also utilized barrage balloons for training, sending them 800 feet into the air with a small basket attached. Trainees would leap into the void, often at night or in thick fog. For every jump from an aircraft, 2 were done from a balloon, a cheaper and more controllable alternative. The practice helped them develop trust in British parachuting methods, even though the Brits typically jumped without a reserve chute. At such low altitudes, a reserve would have been useless anyway. When it came to forming teams, Singlaub explained that it was partly organic and partly scientific. Sometimes friendships determined partnerships. An American might bond with a French officer over shared humor or mutual respect. But the OSS also relied heavily on psychological profiling to ensure team compatibility. The same psychologist who had assessed candidates back at the Congressional Country Club in Maryland contributed input to the selection process. When the final team assignments were announced at Milton Hall, Singlaub found himself paired with Sergeant Tony Deno, a radio operator from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and a French officer named Jacques de Penguilly, whose nom de guerre was Dominique Leb. The 3 men bonded instantly, spending nearly all their time together refining their skills and learning to anticipate each other's moves, an essential quality for small teams operating behind enemy lines. Around this same period, Singlaub met the man who would later become a key figure in U.S. intelligence, Bill Casey, who would go on to head the CIA decades later. At the time, Casey was serving as an OSS officer and acted as their case officer for the mission. Singlaub recalled that Casey came out to the airfield where the teams were being held in isolation, checked their readiness, delivered the final mission briefings, and distributed the ominous L-tablets, cyanide pills meant for suicide in case of capture. It was a chilling reminder of the stakes they faced. Every man understood that the moment he parachuted into occupied Europe, he was stepping into a deadly chess game against the Gestapo. But for Singlaub and his comrades, that danger was the essence of their calling, a test of courage, loyalty, and unbreakable resolve that would lay the foundation for the future of American special operations. When asked about Bill Casey, who would later become director of the CIA, John Singlaub remembered a lean Navy lieutenant who arrived in civilian clothes, spoke slowly but possessed a sharp, informed mind about operations in France. Casey, a New York lawyer before William Donovan recruited him, embodied Donovan's knack for selecting staff from diverse backgrounds: academics, museum curators, lawyers. Men and women whose varied skills complemented the OSS unconventional mission and whose personalities made others want to follow Donovan into the unknown. When Casey offered the Grimmel tablets for use in the event of capture, Singlaub refused them outright. He believed surrender must never be an option and made that resolve clear to his teammates. Spring 1944 was charged with a sense that invasion was imminent, but personal misfortune struck. Singlaub suffered severe abdominal pains and was diagnosed with appendicitis, requiring surgery that threatened to keep him out of action. Torn between medical prudence and the bitter fear of missing the invasion, he was buoyed only by the promise of his American surgeon that he could be fit to jump in weeks. A hope the British medical staff dismissed as wishful thinking. D-Day came while he was still in hospital, and Singlaub was devastated to have missed it, yet his comrades Jacques and Tony came to his bedside and pledged to wait for him. Plans shifted, not because of cowardice but due to operational security and bureaucratic caution. No Jedburghs were dispatched prior to D-Day as some of Eisenhower's World War I-era staff hesitated to approve large-scale agent drops. Unfamiliar with the relative survivability of parachuted operatives, and delays only ended after expert advisors were brought in. Meanwhile, Singlaub's mission was retarget from Brittany to support the forthcoming southern invasion. His orders would have him organize and train bands of irregulars in central France and arrange weapons and supply drops, working with two distinct French resistance currents. The AS or Armée Secrète, composed largely of regular French officers who had stayed behind and who were disciplined, reliable, and primarily in need of material rather than instruction, and the FTP, the Franktireurs et partisans, communist partisans whose loyalty to de Gaulle was sometimes nominal and whose political ties, occasionally fed through the Soviet embassy in Bern, meant they often preferred to operate in and hold towns, a posture that would give them a significant post-war political advantage despite the presence of genuine patriots among their ranks. On the night of August 11, 1944, Singlaub and his team boarded a Sterling bomber from a special squadron and joined the bomber stream for a stealthy low-altitude penetration. Near the edge of friendly fighter cover, their pilots simulated a return to England, dove beneath German radar, and then resumed course, while a hastily embarked French SAS element was dropped before them. Sadly, some of those men landed miles off target, but Singlaub's own drop came down with precision, at the designated DZ. Fires had been lit in a prearranged alignment, and a small signal lamp flashed the Morse letters confirming that night's pickup code. On the ground they were met by an SOE agent named Simon, a Brit raised in France whose networks had already scouted the area, confirming that local resistance cells were partially organized and urgently needed the kind of advisors, trainers, and secure supply channels the Jedburghs had been trained to provide. Simon led us off the drop zone with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew every shadow of the countryside, introduced us to Hubert, the wiry, intense leader of the Armée Secrète, and then melted back into the night, leaving us to be hustled into a low, fragrant barn where we collapsed from exhaustion and slept on hay. In the gray of morning, the farmer's daughter appeared with a mushroom omelette that tasted like a luxury from another life, a precious reminder of Real eggs after weeks in England, when the soldier's ration amounted to no more than powdered substitute and one lonely egg a week. From that barn our attention quickly focused on the nearest cluster of enemy strength, about 20 kilometers away in the town of Egeltons, where the Germans were visibly preparing to make a stand, pulling troops out of downtown and massing them on a fortified school atop a small rise, a hulking structure of reinforced concrete and stone with clear fields of fire that made it an ideal strongpoint and a serious headache for us. Working with two very different French currents complicated every plan. The Armée Secrète were professional and dependable, led by regular officers who wanted supplies and direction, while the FTP, the communist Franktireurs et partisans, were less predictable, eager to fight on their own timetable and sometimes acting on instructions routed through unexpected channels. When coded BBC broadcasts told us to strike the German garrisons in a few days, we trusted London's timetable, but the FTP at Eggletons began their assault a day early, a premature move that threatened to draw an armored relief column from Clermont-Ferrand, some 50 kilometers away, with armored cars, mortars, and heavy machine guns that could have smashed our nascent uprising if the siege dragged on. What the Germans did not grasp was the wider net we had cast. The other 3 garrisons in our sector had been isolated and effectively besieged, their lines cut and their telephones interrupted by the resistance. At Brive and Toul the garrisons insisted on surrendering to an American, and because I was the only American present, Hubert drove me in his car to accept their formal capitulation before we hurried back to the grinding violence at Eggletons. The German force there, we estimated, numbered between 150 and 200 troops and included elements tied to the infamous Das Reich Panzer Division, well armed, with anti-tank guns and a radio that gave them a tactical edge the other garrisons lacked. While those others had to rely on fragile telephone links we controlled and could sever, Eggletons could call for help, which made it the focal point of danger. I found myself in the thick of it trying to reconnoiter from the attic of a 2-story house that offered a good vantage toward the school. In a heartbeat the world sharpened into survival instinct as an anti-tank round punched through the roof just where I had been standing a moment before, and as I moved around the attic I unwittingly stepped between the entry and exit holes of that shell fire, blocking light and drawing the gunners' attention. They shifted the piece my way, and I scrambled down a ladder mere seconds before another round tore the space I'd vacated. A sniper's shot shredded the slate above me, showering fragments that lacerated my face and tore at my right ear until I bled like a struck animal. FTP men in the yard gaped at the sight, stunned, as I snatched up a Bren gun and an extra magazine and slipped through the streets unseen, finding cover in the hedgerows. From that hidden position I zeroed in on the camouflaged anti-tank gun, emptied a full magazine into its crew and saw men fall, reloaded, and when they attempted to remount the gun I hammered them again with the Bren until that threat was silenced. After that, the gun never fired on us again. When asked whether his bravery made any impression on the FTP troops, JS explained that most of them lacked any real understanding of what it meant to fight in a war. They were volunteers, untrained and largely unwilling to learn military discipline or tactics. War for them was more about defiance than coordination. But when they saw an American willingly risk his life under fire, when they watched JS charge into danger, bleeding and determined, it struck them deeply. It made them realize that their foreign allies were not there merely to command or observe, but to share the danger and the purpose. JS recalled telling them plainly that his team wanted to help, but not to do their fighting for them, a distinction that carried both respect and a challenge. Soon after, the French SAS team arrived, about 24 well-trained men who had been trained by the British Special Air Service. Unlike the FTP, these soldiers were disciplined, efficient, and experienced in small unit tactics. They carried a British 2-inch mortar, roughly comparable to the American 60 mm, though they were short on ammunition. The group's immediate problem was a German-held school building, 4 stories tall and built of reinforced concrete, that commanded the entire area from its upper floors. The Germans on the top floor had a perfect line of sight over the battlefield, making every movement costly for the resistance. JS offered to act as the SAS forward observer, and together they devised a plan. The SAS fired several rounds into the roof, igniting a blaze that spread rapidly. As the top of the building burned out, the Germans who had used it as a vantage point were left exposed, their effectiveness sharply reduced. But just as the tide seemed to turn, the sky above Eggletons darkened with the sound of approaching aircraft. JS and his men were suddenly attacked by German Heinkel He 111 bombers flying at dangerously low altitude. They dropped butterfly bombs, small anti-personnel devices that spun in the air, releasing their safety pins before settling silently into the grass. These bomblets were terrifying, JS remembered, because unlike the larger bombs, which exploded instantly upon impact, these small killers waited. They could detonate with the slightest touch, making the entire field a deadly minefield. The ordinary 100-kilo bomb was less terrifying, he explained, because at least you could see it coming, and when it went off, the danger was over. But those damned bomblets just sat there, waiting for someone to stumble. Amid this chaos, one Heinkel made a fatal mistake. It flew so low that JS and his men were able to open fire with Bren guns. He remembered seeing their bullets strike the aircraft's fuselage and wings, the plane jerking as if in pain. The Heinkel wobbled, turned southwest, and disappeared. Later, they learned it had crashed. The relief was short-lived, however, as more Luftwaffe fighter bombers arrived, Focke-Wulf FW-190s this time, swooping down to drop single bombs and rake the countryside with machine gun fire. The OSS team was overwhelmed. JS requested air support, only to receive a sarcastic message from OSS headquarters in London. He later accused Bill Casey of being behind the remark, though Casey only smiled when confronted. The message read, "You're getting more air attacks than the invasion force at Normandy." It was true. The Luftwaffe had been forced inland after D-Day, and Egeltons lay closer to Germany than the beaches of Normandy. Unfortunately, unlike the Allied armies, JS and his men had no anti-aircraft defenses. Eventually, the siege of Egeltons began to unravel. The Germans' anti-Maquis relief column finally arrived from the east. JS and the resistance set up ambushes along the road, but once it became clear that the enemy's superior numbers and firepower would break through, they were forced to withdraw into the surrounding hills. Jacques, one of the French commanders, coordinated with the SAS to harass any Germans trying to escape or regroup. Meanwhile, word came that the FTP believed a German force from Brive and Toul, two towns where surrender had already been negotiated, was regrouping to attack them. JS, however, suspected this was yet another case of poor intelligence from the FTP, who were often driven more by fear and rumor than by accurate reconnaissance. It was a moment that captured the entire complexity of the resistance war in France. Brave but undisciplined fighters, professional but outnumbered Allied teams, and an enemy both determined and ruthless. In the midst of this chaos, JS and his team continued their mission, outnumbered, under fire, and surrounded by uncertainty, but still pressing forward for the liberation of France. JS recalled that tensions between the different French resistance factions began to take their toll after the success of the Allied supported groups in the area. The FTP, or Franksterers et partisans, grew resentful of the achievements of the AS, or Armée Secrète, whose operations with the OSS and SAS were producing tangible results against the Germans. This jealousy quickly turned into damaging rumors that spread across the region, undermining trust and coordination. The FTP did not like the idea that the AS was having success, JS said, and the rumors greatly weakened our ability to operate. The discord was more than a nuisance. It directly affected combat readiness. When the time came to set up new ambush positions, the FTP refused to participate. Left without their manpower, JS and his team relied entirely on the AS fighters, who proved themselves to be disciplined, reliable, and courageous. The AS ambushes worked perfectly. When the Germans reached Egeltons, they discovered only a few wounded men left behind and quickly realized the area was hostile. Attempting to retreat westward, they ran into another series of well-prepared AS ambushes that forced them to abandon their route and retreat back to Clermont-Ferrand. With the Germans withdrawing and local strongholds collapsing, the region around Egeltons was effectively cleared of enemy presence. "We looked for a new mission," JS said, though he did not immediately recognize the scale of what they had accomplished. Without the aid of conventional Allied ground forces, the Department of Correes, and several neighboring departments, had liberated themselves. It was one of the few regions in occupied France where the resistance, guided by small Allied teams, achieved such success independently. Meanwhile, the broader German army was retreating from the Atlantic Wall toward Germany, choosing to bypass southern routes altogether. They avoided JS's region entirely, choosing instead to move north, just below the Loire River. Seizing this opportunity, JS received permission from London to take a detachment of AS troops northward to harass the retreating columns. "We made sure they didn't come down our way," he said with satisfaction. "We made it very unpopular to go through our area." Mobility, however, was a major challenge. Lacking military vehicles and fuel, JS's team resorted to using local farm trucks powered by makeshift charcoal burners. These were primitive contraptions, stoves mounted on the back of trucks that produced flammable gas by heating charcoal, which was then piped into the engine. The setup was noisy, cumbersome, and painfully slow, not conducive to making a fast getaway, as JS put it. The men would ride the trucks to ambush sites, park them at a safe distance, and proceed on foot. After each operation, they returned to the trucks, often exhausted and in a hurry to leave, but the engines could not start immediately. They had to stoke the fire and wait for the gas pressure to build up before the vehicle could even move. Escape under fire, therefore, was almost impossible, a nerve-wracking limitation they had to accept as part of guerrilla warfare. Another important operation during this period was the preparation of an abandoned German airfield, which the resistance hoped to use as a makeshift transport base. The airfield had been heavily bombed earlier in the war, leaving the runways cratered and littered with unexploded ordnance. JS and his men carefully cleared delayed action bombs, devices that could detonate hours or even days after being dropped. Because the field lay beyond the range of the small British Lysander transport aircraft, they arranged instead for larger Hudson bombers to land there. These flights were essential for one of their secondary missions, evacuating downed Allied airmen who had been hidden by local resistance cells. The area, remote and forested, was an ideal refuge for such escapees. Once air transport became possible, the OSS organized exfiltration operations to get these pilots and crewmen safely back to England. Eventually, JS and his French counterpart Jacques boarded a Hudson aircraft and flew to London. There they attended a series of high-level conferences discussing the next phase of Jedburgh operations. One ambitious plan under review was the establishment of a new JED base inside Austria. Intelligence reports indicated that a large number of escaped French laborers were hiding in the Tyrol Mountains after fleeing German forced labor camps. The plan was to parachute in special teams to organize and arm them for sabotage and resistance. The British and American intelligence services quickly approved the concept, but the French government, having re-established its intelligence service in liberated Paris, insisted on control over all French personnel. Jacques was recalled to Paris to report to his superiors, while JS prepared to return to France to rejoin his men. His return journey was perilous. Traveling by automobile through territory still crawling with retreating German units, JS and his team had to rely on both cunning and luck. They were instructed to cross the Loire River near Orleans, where elements of the U.S. Army had already established bridgeheads. After days of tense driving, they finally encountered American troops on the southern bank, who were astonished to see them emerge from German-held country. They couldn't imagine how we had come through that territory full of Germans, JS recalled. His secret, however, was a clever observation. German convoys moved with strict regularity. By studying their timing, JS learned to exploit the gaps between columns. The Germans were very methodical, he explained. Once you knew the interval between their convoys, you could cut the time in half and get on the road in between them. It was not all hardship and hunger. Amid the terror and the raids, we stole moments of unexpected grace and ordinary pleasures that kept us human. There were still grand old chateaux in the countryside where aristocratic families had hoarded cellars of wine behind newly bricked walls, and when those towns were finally declared clear, the owners, relieved and generous, would pry open their secret caches and invite us in, pouring deep, heady glasses of vintage wine or uncorking 50-year-old cognac. As though to mark the world's stubborn insistence on beauty even in ruin, our rations for long stretches became deliciously simple: cheeses the size of small wheels, warm crusty bread still steaming from ovens, and the constant comforting presence of wine, which oddly solved the perplexing logistics of Class 1 supplies for a while, even as stress, strain, and pain gnawed at us from the edges. After France, our little team remained intact because there was talk of a new Jedburgh-type mission into Austria, and though the plan had political layers, post-war Austria to be administered by 4 allied powers, each with a veto on operations, I confided to Jacques that I feared bureaucratic delays would see the war end before we could act there, and so I volunteered for the Far East. 30 days leave in the United States yielded a whirlwind of briefings, a wedding, and more training. This time on Catalina Island, before I took command of an OSS contingent that boarded a troopship at San Pedro for a 35-day zigzag voyage to Calcutta via Melbourne and Perth. From Calcutta we threaded by rail and truck toward the Himalayan approaches, Dinjan to Chabua, and when the impatience of the theater kept us from flying over the hump for weeks, I offered our squad to help OSS Detachment 101 move its BAMO headquarters along the Lido Road, a stretch still menaced by Japanese stragglers and Chinese bandits. It was almost ironic that the ambusher had become the scout for ambushes, scanning for likely kill zones instead of laying them. Once in Kunming, I reported to Colonel Richard Hepner and was parceled out to a new assignment: to train a guerrilla band of young Vietnamese at posts near the Chinese-Indo-Chinese border, an area that, unbeknownst to me at the time, sat under the uneasy influence of Ho Chi Minh, who believed he commanded all of Vietnam and expected any foreign effort to be cleared through his channels. A posture that stalled my operations repeatedly and introduced a political friction I hadn't bargained for. My task, bluntly stated, was to parachute into Vietnam with enough demolition to sever the vital road and rail artery that threaded from a Hanoi Delta through mountain gorges to Lang Son, for that was the route the Japanese 21st Division would take if ordered to oppose any American landing in China. Such a landing was part of a larger deception plan: to pin Japanese forces in China and keep them from reinforcing defenses against the main U.S. invasion of Japan. So cutting that route was not merely tactical but strategic. We intended to make it unusable at the moment of need, and though Ho dismissed the area as unimportant, the truth was that we could not reveal our reasons without compromising the broader deception, so we pressed on without French officers whom the OSS suggested we carry along. French influence was nominal in the field, and their presence would have been more complication than help. Determined to surgically disrupt the enemy's lines and shape the map of operations in ways that, for better or worse, extended the reach of the war well beyond the fields of Europe. The situation on Hainan Island was one that could have collapsed catastrophically at any moment if we hadn't applied the right mix of caution, decisiveness, and improvisation. The Japanese garrison there was well-armed, alert, and completely unaccustomed to surrender, so my approach had to be both tactical and psychological. Before the operation, I had been briefed in Kunming by an OSS specialist who had spent time as a military attaché in Japan prior to the war. He knew the Japanese mindset, their hierarchy, and how they reacted under pressure, and he advised that I assume the authority of a major immediately upon insertion, even though I was only a captain. Accordingly, when we jumped into the area, I was wearing major's insignia, a symbolic but critical decision that projected the authority necessary to control the situation. On arrival, we were confronted by a guardhouse surrounded by Japanese sentries, who were clearly ready to fire on anyone attempting to escape or assert control. Inside was a Japanese captain, but I immediately told him that he was not senior enough to negotiate with me and insisted that his colonel be summoned. Outside the door, my radio operator Ralph overheard the captain arguing, insisting that the major was demanding a surrender and would talk only to the colonel. That night we were placed in a building that had once served as a hospital ward, and I quickly set up a roster for continuous guard duty. Every minute mattered, and we knew we could not afford to be caught off guard. The tension was immense. We had no certainty of what would happen next, and though MacArthur's orders had instructed Japanese garrisons to cooperate with allies, the message clearly had not reached this isolated island. The following day, the Japanese colonel arrived from the northern coast, and I immediately took control of the meeting space, seating our men in the place of honor to establish dominance in the room. I explained the situation clearly. I would not accept the surrender formally, because the Chinese army would be the legitimate recipient, but I needed immediate access to the senior Allied prisoners of war. They quickly produced Lieutenant Colonel W.J.R. Scott, an Australian officer, and a Dutch officer. The POWs numbered just over 390, slightly fewer than our planning estimate of 400, but their condition was appalling. They were near starvation, suffering from disease and neglect, victims of deliberate malnutrition. Once Scott and the Dutch officer were at the table, I effectively commandeered every Japanese facility available, transport, food stores, and medical supplies, and began immediate action to improve the POW's condition. Meals increased from 2 a day to 4, then 5 small portions, a stepwise approach that prevented further health crises. Our situation was complicated by the loss of supplies and our radio during the drop, but we improvised. I arranged for reconnaissance aircraft to fly over the drop zone daily, displaying panels to communicate our status to Kunming. Evacuation of ambulatory POWs proved equally complex. I took the first trainload to the southern tip of the island, only to find that Chinese guerrillas in the hills had sabotaged the track and derailed the train. Displaying a Red Cross flag prevented any hostile fire, and a Japanese repair crew helped us resume movement. By evening we reached an unused airfield, where my resourceful radio operator revived a powerful Japanese transmitter and finally established contact with Kunming, convincing them of the situation after repeated challenges. We requested a doctor, and when one was delivered by parachute on the next aircraft, he dislocated his shoulder upon landing. Yet the mission pressed on. Our medic quickly set the arm, allowing the doctor to become fully operational despite his injury. Every action, from asserting authority over the Japanese command, to coordinating the care and evacuation of malnourished POWs, to improvising communications and medical support, required split-second judgment and innovative problem-solving, proving the combination of OSS training, careful planning and adaptability was essential to saving lives and stabilizing a volatile, potentially deadly situation. After the intense and exhausting operations on Hainan Island, we focused on making the airfield operational again. The runway had been riddled with craters from previous bombings, and we worked tirelessly to fill them so that AC-47 could safely land. My immediate goal was to establish contact with escaped POWs and other Allied personnel who were hiding in the hills or with guerrilla forces in the interior of the island. When the next transport plane arrived, I devised a creative method to communicate our presence and the end of hostilities. Using reserve pilot chutes, I attached bottles of atabrine along with notes in Chinese, Japanese, and English, explaining that the war was over and that we were there to retrieve all Allied personnel. We buzzed the villages, dropping these small chutes, and the inclusion of the atabrine gave credibility to the message, making clear that it truly came from American forces. Complications arose when our supply service sent an aged lieutenant colonel with no combat experience, whose orders were ostensibly to relieve the OSS team. Misinterpreting his role, he attempted to take over operations and treated OSS personnel with outright hostility, antagonizing our intelligence efforts. Simultaneously, the Japanese accused my deputy on the other side of the island of misconduct, necessitating an urgent response. I jumped from an incoming aircraft in free fall to reach him, only to discover that my deputy had done nothing wrong but had instead found a camp housing approximately 5,000 Chinese slave laborers living in appalling conditions. The camp was worse than anything we had previously encountered, and we immediately provided what food and medical supplies we could, elevating their priority for future drops. Following this, I personally rode the train back to the coast with the last group of POWs. During my absence, the inexperienced lieutenant colonel had embarrassed himself spectacularly at a Japanese dinner, forcing my men to attend and making outrageous statements that glorified Japan's actions at Pearl Harbor. He even declared that my team would no longer be involved, which infuriated my personnel. Recognizing the futility of having him continue, I recommended to Kunming that the OSS team be withdrawn, and they agreed. We departed Hainan aboard an Australian destroyer for Hong Kong, arriving just in time to witness the formal end of the war. That evening, sitting on the veranda of the Peninsula Hotel, we watched the assembled fleet erupt in pyrotechnics, a fitting celebration after such a grueling and meaningful mission. Reflecting on the experience, it is clear that William Donovan had a profound understanding of unconventional warfare. The OSS approach emphasized small, highly capable teams that trained and empowered local forces to execute operations. Whether in occupied France, China, or Vietnam, we relied on our skills to guide indigenous personnel, maximizing effectiveness while minimizing our own exposure. Today, Singlaub observed, there seems to be too much focus on direct action, special operators launching raids themselves, rather than fostering local capability to carry out missions independently, a principle that was central to the OSS philosophy. Following World War II, General John K. Singlaub continued a distinguished military career that spanned decades and multiple conflicts. He served as chief of the military liaison mission to Mukden, Manchuria, and completed 2 combat tours in the Korean War. During the Vietnam War, he commanded the Joint Unconventional Warfare Task Force (MACSOG), contributing significantly to the development of U.S. Special Operations doctrine. Beyond his combat roles, he played a key part in establishing the U.S. Army Ranger Training Center at Fort Benning, Georgia, leaving a lasting legacy in elite military training. General Singlaub passed away in January 2022 at the age of 100, leaving behind a storied career chronicled in his autobiography Hazardous Duty, An American Soldier in the 20th Century, a testament to a life defined by courage, innovation, and dedication to his country.